Yanis, can you hear me? Great. This laptop here could come on screen now, if that's cool. Perfect. Great. Okay, thanks very much. We'll get started again. I'd like to introduce the first speaker of this second panel. I should have mentioned earlier, you probably all know already, that there are programs available on the table that will guide you through the structure of the day. If you didn't know that, then they're on the table outside. Nando Sigona is Senior Lecturer and Deputy Director of the Institute of Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham. His research interests include statelessness, diasporas and the state, Romani politics and anti-Gypsyism, illegality and the everyday experiences of undocumented migrant children and young people, and crisis governance and governmentality of forced migration in the EU, Mediterranean boat migration, Brexit and intra-European migration, and unaccompanied youth migration. He is author or editor of books and journals including Unravelling Europe's Migration Crisis from 2017, Within and Beyond Citizenship, also 2017, the Oxford Handbook on Refugee and Forced Migration Studies from 2014, and Sans Papier, The Social and Economic Lives of Undocumented Migrants from 2014. He is Associate Editor of the journal Migration Studies and has written for Newsweek, The Independent, Libération, Open Democracy and The Conversation. He has held visiting research and teaching positions at University of Oxford and the European University Institute. Thank you very much, Nando Sigona.
First of all, thank you to the organizer. It's not an easy presentation in a sense. You will see that in a way the language I use is slightly different from what you had before, and obviously I talked from a perspective of a sociologist that works around issues of refugees and migration, and in particular I will talk of my work on the refugee and migration crisis in the Mediterranean. What I'm trying to do today is somehow unpack and deconstruct all the narrative of the crisis that we have become in a way so familiar with in the last 4 years. And I slightly changed the title of the presentation. This is why, and the title is Stop This Carnage, the Politics of Death and Rescue in Europe, Migration Crisis. The kind of question I'm interested in is how have dead bodies impacted on the way that the European Union has responded to the refugee crisis, but also probably more interestingly, try to understand what kind of dead bodies we cry or we claim for, and what others are forgotten as part of this process of mourning. And in a sense, what I'm trying to do is to look at what bodies count and which one not. As Daniel was mentioning, this is part of a project called MedMig that involved 500 interviews with refugees and migrants in Italy, Malta, Turkey, and Greece in between 2015 and 2016. And a book is coming out in a couple of weeks called Unravelling the Europe Migration Crisis. Okay. Just to give you a sense of where these voices on which I'm building this presentation come from. So the blue dots indicate the departure point of the people we spoke to, and the orange one indicate the points where we met them and we spoke with them. So you can see, while in the case of Greece, it was mostly an encounter at the point of entry, so on Lesbos and the island, and in Thessaloniki and at Athens. In Italy, we had multiple points of entry into these communities, both in Sicily, in Calabria, I mean, the place where people were disembarking, but also in Rome and Milan and Turin, because we're the place of transit. Why is this the case? Because some people that came through the Mediterranean migration, through the boats, stopped in Italy and became asylum seekers, so they applied for asylum in Italy. But some other groups completely disappeared, so they landed in Sicily, and then within 3-4 days they went out of the country. And the only place you could encounter them were the train station in Rome or in Milan. This is, for example, the case in 2015 of the Syrians or the Sudanese. So you have, for example, thousands of Sudanese nationals that arrived in Sicily, and then only about 10 or 12 applied for asylum in Italy. So where they end up to? So it was why, in a sense, how you do the research is also shaped by the reality of the flows that we were trying to capture. What I want to do today is to reflect on what I call the official politics of mourning for the people that died at sea, and then try to build on the interviews we did with refugees and migrants and explore their own experience or witness of death and violence, and see how this encounter worked out. Just because now, I mean, we have, since the so-called refugee crisis, there have been other major news that have diverted our attention. Just to give you a few sort of top-line numbers, just to give a sense of, remember what we are talking about. About between 2014 and 2016, there were about 1.6 million people that crossed the Mediterranean by boat irregularly. About 12,000 died or were missing in the sea in the same period of time. In 2015 alone, we had over 845,000 people that moved from Turkey into Greece, and about 150,000 from Libya, mostly into Italy. So just a point to take from this is that while we got a situation that has been spreading over the years, 2015 was kind of an exceptional year. I mean, most of what we call refugee crisis was around 2015 in terms of number. However, if you just need to look a little bit closer, and then things start to unfold a bit more interesting. For example, we tend to talk about refugee crisis as if it was a kind of homogeneous flow, an homogeneous situation, while you look at the profile of the people that came in Greece and Italy, and the situation starts to be a bit more complicated. For example, if you think at the top 5 nationality that moved from Turkey into Greece, and the top 5 nationality that moved from Libya into Italy, well, there is no overlap. So it's completely different people. So it's people that come from different stories altogether. The other point which is interesting, while we use one refugee crisis, if you look Italy and Greece, you got basically Greece being about 5 times bigger than Italy in terms of the number of arrival, which means from a point of view of logistics, a completely different situation. I mean, in a sense, what Greece had to deal with was not what Italy had to deal with. If you look at, then I'll show you later about the continuity of the crisis. In the case of Italy, is actually, you can see how there is a very sort of a nice, interesting pace of these flows, which is not what we saw in the case of Greece, for example. And the other thing which is interesting to take from this is, while the top 5 country of origin in Greece represent over the 96% of arrival, so you have others only 4%. In the case of Italy, it's actually 41% are the others. What does it mean in terms of narratives? On one side, you can very much almost characterize the arrival as the people that come from the largest, the most war-torn areas in the world. You've got the Syrians, you've got the Afghani, you've got Iraq. As alone, they make the majority of the arrival. In the case of Italy, you got Eritrea, Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, Gambia, but then you got all these other countries. You have 18 nationalities that have more than 1% of arrival. So if I'm going to try to explain what are the motivation of the people, what's this link bringing them to Italy, it's actually more complicated than just the story of the Syrian refugee crisis. So when we talk about crisis, already we need to speak of it in plural, as a plural. And here what I was stressing around the regularities and irregularities, As you can see, the black line capture arrivals in Italy between 2013 and 2017. You can see that actually there is a clear repetition. So over the summer month, you have higher number of arrivals, then they go down, they go come up again. The lighter gray one is actually Greece. You can see the exceptionality of what happened in 2015 and 2016 clearly captured in this line. So we have, in a sense, have to think about what's going on with applying different lenses. And this is not exactly what happened. And clearly, in the way that we have narrated the refugee crisis, there was clearly, there were some sort of crucial events that, in a sense, triggered a sort of reaction by European policymakers and institutions. Yeah, and there are three moments in particular that played a major role in what we call European refugee crisis. There is the incident in Lampedusa in which over 300 people died in October 2013. As a result of that, Italy launched the program called Mare Nostrum, which basically was led by the Italian Navy. And in 1 year of life, they actually rescued at sea over 150,000 people. So in 1 year alone, the Italian Navy, with the support of other organizations like, for example, MOAS, a privately owned search and rescue organization, saved over 153,000 people. But then another major change happened in April 2015, when in 1 month alone you have about 1,200 people that die in a series of tragedies. And as a result of that, the European Union significantly increased the presence of boats at sea that were doing a rescue operation, put much more resources, and changed the term of engagement. The third episode doesn't involve a large number of people, but was the case of the death of the 3-year-old Kurdish Syrian Alan Kurdi. That's him when he was still alive. And as a result of that, he started a policy that was called the open door policy for Syrians in Germany, that basically played a major role in having the opening up what was then called the Balkan route. So we can maybe remember those images of people queuing along the routes of the Balkans, going towards in Slovenia, Croatia, and then try to cross into Hungary, be bounced back, and then trying another place. So that was very much following on what happened on a shore in Turkey. However, there is, if I think about the significance of death, it's not all about that these episodes of death produced some action. There is also a pendulum here. There is also the opposite. And this is why we need to start to think about the people that died at sea as the victims of the EU border regime. So, for example, once the Operation Mare Nostrum closed after 12 months, it was replaced by another search and rescue operation called Triton, and that was led by the European Union and Frontex, which is the border agency of the European Union. And soon after this change, what you see is that the number of people that died at sea went up incredibly fast. So, for example, if you compare, and this is why I think sometimes numbers are useful, because they really enable you to capture something that was happening. Between January and April 2014, and if you compare with the following year, so in 2014 you have a Mare Nostrum, 2015 you got Triton. In the same month you have, in 2014, 60 people died. In 2015 you had 1,700. So something happened. And it's not only the weather condition. It is, and the reason is, you can clearly see from this map, is that the area where the search and rescue operation were happening was moved from the territorial waters of Libya to basically the yellow zone around Italy. So it means that basically there was not enough time for the search and rescue boat to reach the areas where the large majority of the shipwreck were happening and people were dying. But another example of the increase in death was the so-called EU and Turkey deal that probably you have heard about. So since March 2015, what is now was known as the Aegean route, the one from Turkey into Lesbos and Greece, was completely closed. But in the few weeks and months before, what we saw, it was the increased number of shipwrecks in that area, something that we had never seen in the past, even when there was many more people arriving. So just to give you a sense again about the what they call the mortality rate of the death rates around the route. So there is a clear difference between which route was more difficult, more dangerous. So in 2015, for example, you have about over 80% of arrival were in Greece, and about 15% were in Italy. But then if you look in terms of where people died, it's actually exactly the opposite. So you have about 80% of people died crossing between Libya and Italy, and a minority instead died crossing between Turkey and Greece. So the easy point here is that one route was much more dangerous, and there are a number of reasons for that. An obvious one is that is different from crossing 600 kilometers from 10 kilometers, mostly. That was one of the explanations, but there are also other. And now we found out about the other explanation. It's about looking at how the death rate changed over the same route rather than a cross route. So just to give you an example, in 2015, the people, about one person every 1,000 died crossing from Turkey to Greece. The following year, before the closure of the route, this went down to one person every 500. So basically, the route between Turkey and Greece became much more dangerous. Partly the reason is because basically the Turkish coastal guard started to have a much more aggressive attitude towards the boats and the dinghies that were crossing. And this meant that people were no longer crossing in the morning when basically you have all those images of the summer when people on Lesbos could take photos of 5-6 dinghies crossing at the same time. I had to cross at night. And they were no longer wearing an orange life jacket, but a black one. And they were no longer having lights with them, but moving in the dark because they didn't want to be spotted by the Turkish Coast Guard. And this meant more people died. But also, if you look at the other route, the central Mediterranean, the Libya to Italy one, there is a very significant increase in the mortality rate over the 3-year period. And this you can very much trace back to the changing policy of border policing over that period of time. But another point which I think is important in these stories of which migrants' bodies we care for and which not, is that in some cases why there is a long history of death at sea that is much longer than the 2013. I mean, there was been counted before, but why at that point it became important? And this is because there are a number of circumstances. For example, in the case of Lampedusa was that there was a new pope. In Italy, there was a new government which was no longer led by Berlusconi, by a more sort of central left kind of minded person. In the case of Libya, was the sheer number of people that died that make the episode significant, and also because at that time, especially the UK government was pushing for this idea that we cannot save people at sea, otherwise more people will try to reach the country. So there was this idea about the pull factors. What happened though, that apart that has been proved as not really actually the case, the sheer number of people that died in that month forced the British government to somehow see again or change their policy at the time. And finally, in the case of Alan Kurdi, there is an issue of the 3-year-old being Assyrians, which have been constructed as the good refugees within the story of the refugee crisis. So there's the one that deserved to be helped because he was probably dressed in Western kind of clothes because was mostly white. And why I'm saying that? Because probably you haven't seen this image instead. So at the same time that Alan Kurdi died, over the same period of time, we have had hundreds of children that have died crossing from Libya and North Africa into Europe, but they never made the news. They didn't appear they were not circulated in many ways. So they had a completely different kind of response. And in this sense, the work of Judith Butler is very important in the sense of capturing that it's not just important to think about which bodies are we crying for, or who are we mourning, but also the one that we are not, in terms of defining who we are. And the case of the European Union in this case was very much about also the extent to which border policies are racialized, and this is something we need to think about much more than we have done today. So we cannot look at the refugee crisis only through a humanitarian lens, because this is not what happened. I mean, we really had different approaches according to the different route where people were coming, and also the perceived deservingness of the people that were crossing made a huge difference. So if I go back to the title of the presentations, Stop This Carnage, it's actually quite interesting to look at that sentence in the context in which it came from. And this was in an editorial that the then Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi wrote in the New York Times. So he says, the Mediterranean Sea cradle of our civilization, is becoming a deathbed for thousands of nameless, desperate men, women, and children. These people had lives full of pain, despair, and hope, which led them to become victims of human trafficking. The voices of mothers who lost their children at sea will haunt our consciences. We must stop this carnage. Okay? Just very briefly, these 3 points, the one I put in bold. Our civilization, which is very interesting about how do you claim, the fact you feel responsible for what you're happening is because in a sense you are claiming it as part of yours. So in a sense, Italy and Europe have always had an interest in the Mediterranean area. So these incidents that were happening in the Mediterranean are ours. By claiming the people dying there, we are also claiming control over that territory. The second point, which is interesting, is this human trafficking. It's clearly identifying who is to blame for this incident, and is the traffickers. It has nothing to do with us. We are just the nice guys here. It's not about us. And the final, which is important, is it's only the people that die at sea that count. You know, as I'll show you later, actually, if you look at the data, there are many more people that die crossing the desert. And this is a similar story if you look from the US-Mexico side. You got the desert of Arizona is is basically a cemetery. So why at sea and why it's actually mattering? And then this is how I move in the second part, and I think I want to highlight. And it's based on the interviews with the people that managed to survive the journey. So there are 3 aspects which I think is interesting here. First of all, that's out of the 500 people that we interviewed, about 20% said they had either direct or indirect experience of witnessing death. Indirect means either there was a friend with whom they were traveling that had a friend dying, or their own friend had died during the journey. So it was a very sort of strong part of their migration experience. The second element is that there was the central Mediterranean route was by far more dangerous than the Eastern Mediterranean. So the people that were coming from Africa had many more experience of death or witnessing death than the other. But then the third point is important, that the very large majority of these experiences were not at sea, but they were on land. So it's people that basically had witnessed death while they were crossing by land. So before even getting into the sea. And what is interesting here is how this experience, these people moving towards Europe, that because they died before reaching the sea, we don't know nothing about. It's not our responsibility. It's like they're outside our sort of civilization, in the sense using Matteo Renzi terms. And in terms of which area of origin are mostly the people that talks about experience of death are people coming from Western and Central Africa among the people we interviewed. So it's interesting that while the most dangerous place is Libya, according to the stories that we collect. So most of these episodes that people are reporting happen in Libya. They very rarely affect Northern African people, but it's mostly people coming from Western and Central Africa that report them. But the other aspect which is important, if I think in terms of policy, is that while the European Union and a lot of our states use avoiding death at sea as a justification for closing the routes. So, for example, when the European Union implemented the EU-Turkey deal, they said this is a way to stop people dying. So we do it with the humanitarian spirit. As I showed before, actually that route was by far the safest one. So if that was the concern, they should have shot the other route, not the one that was cheaper and safer for people to cross first. But also the fact that, in a sense, when we talked with people, the death at sea, because it was just at the end of the journey, people were having a completely different attitude to it. I mean, the whole journey was extremely dangerous. So, in a sense, it was almost making sense at that point to cross. Because if I survived until now, maybe God is with me, and this very much there was this sense of talking to God, in the sense, inshallah, if I will manage. So it's quite interesting that because the way that the story has been told from a European perspective was all focused on the sea, you have missed all the point about why people are continuing to try to cross, despite the danger associated to that. So, and this is just to close. It's a quote from an Ethiopian woman that we interviewed. We were very afraid on the boat. We could die. But at that point, if you have lived the terrible things I saw in Libya and other countries, you don't care anymore about dying. It is almost better to die. If we are right, okay. Okay, if I die, whatever God wants. Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce the second speaker on this panel. Oliver Chanarin is one half of the artist collaborators Adam Broomberg and Oliver Chanarin, a complete person, but one half of the collaborative duo. They live and work between London and Berlin and are professors of photography at the Hochschule für Bildende Kunst in Hamburg, Germany. Together they have had numerous solo exhibitions, including the Hasselblad Center for Contemporary Art at Wildawski Castle, Warsaw, Jumex Foundation, Mexico City, Mostin Landudno, UK, Townhouse Cairo, and Stedelijk Museum, Amsterdam. Their participation in international group shows includes Yokohama Triennial, Documenta Kassel, the British Art Show 8, Conflict Time Photography at Tate Modern, and Museum Folkwang, Essen. Major awards include the ICP Infinity Award for their project Holy Bible, and the Deutsche Börse Photography Prize for their work War Primer 2. Thanks very much, Oliver Chanarin.
Momento cagrapivo l'occhio in terra da stupendo sti 20 anni di tormento colutori sempre in guerra notti e giorni terra che non senti, che non fai capire, che non dici niente, vedendomi morire, terra che non tieni, vuoi partire e non decido mi falli tornare e chiangi che ha Nina e chiangi che ha Nina terra che non senti, che non fai capire, che non dici niente, vedendomi morire, terra che non tieni, vuoi partire e non decido mi falli tornare e chiangi che ha Nina e chiangi che ha Nina stanni curugori sempre in guerra notti e giorni
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. It sounds like this morning was incredible. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here, but it's a real honor to be part of this conversation, and a really important conversation. And as a white South African Jewish heterosexual, it feels really important to have a voice in this conversation. And I wanted to start with this most recent piece of work that Adam and I have just made in collaboration with TfL out in the underground. And this work is currently showing in King's Cross Station, where it's seen by several million people a week, I think. I don't know exactly the numbers. And it's situated there in a really smart way at this point, this crossroads between Europe and Britain, at the Eurostar, at the station, just between, in the ticket hall. And I think it's a really interesting question to think about, maybe in the panel discussion later. What race is the digger? For me, she's a white European woman. But so what is she? Is she, and what's interesting is the piece of music that she's singing is an old Italian Sicilian song. It's in Sicilian dialect, and it's a song that was written at the turn of the century about the exodus of men from Italy, specifically from Sicily, to America. And of course, at that time, Italians were not considered white. Italians, Irish, Jews, they were not white. They became white. And so the story of immigration is a story of becoming whiter. And so I think it's very interesting to think about. So we thought it was quite interesting to take the song that was written about migration from Italy to America and somehow try to apply it and use it as a lens for looking at the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, crises in the Mediterranean. So that's what I wanted to say about that, and we can talk more about that film. But just very briefly, the inspiration for the film was really thinking about those boats as objects of culture and a testimony to not just people coming from Europe, from Africa to Europe, but also culture. Those boats are exquisite objects. They're hand-painted, they're handmade. They ought to be brought over and put into the British Museum if people still did that kind of thing. But they have, I think, the status of any Fang mask that has been taken out of West Africa and put into the Met in New York. So we wanted to somehow save some piece of evidence of these relics before they got destroyed. And of course, the film is called the Bureaucracy of Angels, and the digger who is singing, who is telling this sad story, this lament, is also literally the mechanism of the state, going through the will of the state and, of course, our will as Europeans. But I'm going to just wind right back to our early career. Adam and I are photographers. We began working together. We're both South African, and we met in South Africa. And one of our first projects was a commission by the Constitutional Court of South Africa to come back to South Africa. We both lived in the UK for a long time, and to make a document of South Africa 10 years after the end of apartheid. And the idea was this would become a book. It was an exhibition that would be shown at the Constitutional Court in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And as many of you may know, South Africa has one of the most radical constitutions of any country on this planet. Which is why we were both so surprised that we were allowed to undertake this task. And what's interesting to think about is that now it would never happen. And I mean that in a good way. But there is no way that two white Jewish men living in London would come back and make a document of South Africa today. It just wouldn't happen. It's not in the DNA of where South Africa is at this point. So I show these pictures really as an example of a problem with the role of the photographer and the idea of the photographer who comes into places like this, a prison in Cape Town, These are portraits that we made. This is a portrait made in a township just outside Cape Town. These were all images that were then exhibited at the Constitutional Court, and they were intended to kind of paint a sort of picture of the new South Africa 10 years after the end of apartheid. And when I was thinking about giving this talk, I decided to go back and look at a short film that we made at the same time, which we made for Channel 4, in which we actually documented our process of photographing the people in these pictures. And I've quickly edited 3 clips just to keep it very short. The first clip shows a man called Mr. Makize. He's living in a migrant hostel in Johannesburg, and it's quite possible that the photograph that we took of him was the first picture that anybody had ever taken of him, except for one image, and that was the one that was for his passport. His passport in South Africa, being able to vote. The second clip that I've picked out is a group of homeless people living on the streets of Johannesburg, and they're talking in quite a violent and angry way about immigration into South Africa from Nigeria. A very interesting dynamic there. There's a huge flow of migration, not north to Europe, but down to South Africa from the rest of Africa. And there's a lot of tension, as I'm sure many of you are aware, between black South Africans and South Africans from other places. And then the last clip you'll see is taken in the Jewish old age home where my grandmother lived before she passed away. And the reason why that's really important is there's a character there called Luba, a very funny old lady, who speaks about her experience of coming to Africa from Eastern Europe and having never seen black people before, and the shock, the absolute shock of that. And what's so important to say is that for the Jews arriving in South Africa, like the Sicilians to America, they were not white. They became white over generations. My parents were white, but my grandparents, you couldn't say they were. And they arrived in this place. There was apartheid. They were migrants coming from Eastern Europe. They were escaping pogroms, and they were really coming from the lowest echelon of society, and they were arriving in South Africa, and the apartheid system meant that they were elevated. They weren't exactly white, but they were certainly elevated above blacks and above coloureds and above Indians. So they slotted right in, and it's an uncomfortable narrative, but the complicity of the Jewish population in South Africa is interesting to talk about in relationship to the apartheid state.
Let me tell you one point. Nigerians, Zambia, people coming from outside, they are living better. We are here, we are born here in South Africa, but Nigerians, they are living better.
Why there's a robbery on the street? Because the people don't have work. The people don't have food. The people don't have places to stay. That's why there's robbery on the streets of South Africa. Government is worried about public disturbance, but they doesn't worry about the people in the country. They don't worry about the children, about the people, old people, young people. They don't worry.
throat is not so good. I've got a bit of laryngitis. So you can't hear me, I suppose.
No, I can hear you.
Yeah. I'm very old. How do you think am I?
75.
I'm 95.
No.
Yeah.
What did you think of South Africa when you arrived here?
I liked it very much, but I didn't like what they are sort of carrying stuff on their head. And I made such shouting in their room. What's happening? Look, a black woman is wearing a basket on her head. She said, you see many, don't worry. I've never seen them before. I've never seen them so black. They're all pure white.
But maybe you should do some exercise.
Yes, I'll do it, yes.
Okay.
Nice two boys. Nice two boys. I wish I was younger. 60 years younger.
I will never forget that woman. Yeah. So this process of traveling around South Africa, taking photographs, in a way, as although we're both South African, really as outsiders, reminds me of another similar kind of a project. This one was undertaken by Jean-Luc Godard in 1970, where he was invited to come back. He was invited to Mozambique by Samora Machel, who was, at that time, he had just come to power. He was the first, it was a Marxist government, post-colonial government, the first post-colonial government, and after I think 300 years of colonial rule, suddenly you had this amazingly charismatic leader, Samora Machel, who invited Jean-Luc Godard and a number of other radical filmmakers, including Jean Rouch, to come to Mozambique and to think about how would you create an image of a nation? How do you create a new image of a nation? One that isn't the colonial image of a nation. So how do you do this? And they spent a lot of time there. They built a TV station, and they did a similar to what we were doing. They were filming in villages, and then they were showing the films in the same villages. 5 minutes. Oh my God, I'm not even halfway through. I'm going to speed up a bit, but they made this lovely magazine, Cahiers de Cinema. The whole issue is dedicated to this project, and they were doing this thing of what they called feedback, where they were filming, and then they were showing the films, and they were trying to work collaboratively with the subjects of their films to produce a new image of a nation. And here you see some photographs that I'm just going to skip through. The important thing to say is that Jean-Luc Godard, when he was thinking about how do we make television for this new nation, he said, I'm going to refuse to use Kodak film. I'm going to shoot on video. Video was very, very, a very new medium at that time. But he insisted that Kodak was racist. Now, what did he mean by that? How is it possible for a piece of film to somehow inhabit some kind of an ideology? Is it possible? I think we often mistakenly think about technology as being ethically neutral in some senses. But of course, all technologies do inhabit the politics and the ethics of their epoch. And the story of Kodak film, as many of you probably know, is a complex one, especially in relationship to color and skin color. And I first learned about this. I'm just going to skip forward. I first learned about this when we were working in our photography lab here in London, and the guy that we work with, the printer, Jason, shouted across to his employee, one of his assistants, "Hey, could you just pass me that Shirley?" And I was like, "What are you talking about, Shirley? Who's Shirley?" And he said, "This is Shirley." Shirley was the first of many women photographed by Kodak as an example of pure white Caucasian skin, and she was these cards were then printed and distributed to labs across America, and there were many generations of these ladies. Not all of them were called Shirley, but the name Shirley stuck even to this day. This was the last white woman that was photographed as a Shirley, which it looks like sometime in the early 80s. But it really sparked our interest, and we became very interested in the story of film and its relationship to race. And it turns out that when, after segregation ended in America, you suddenly had black and white children in the same classroom, and it was a problem when you were trying to photograph groups of children, because you could either expose for the black child or for the white child, but it was impossible to expose for both in the same frame. So that was a problem. And then early colour film suffered from similar inadequacies in rendering brown tones. And two of Kodak's biggest clients complained about this. They said they were the confectionery industry. They were struggling to photograph chocolate. And the furniture industry, they were struggling to photograph furniture, wood. And they complained. And in collaboration with Kodak, they developed a new film which was Kodak Gold, and they developed this film, and it was much, much better at rendering brown things. And they promoted this film as being good for photographing the details of a dark horse in low light. So that was an incredibly poetic phrase that ended up becoming the title of an exhibition that we did. Around this time, there's no way I can finish in 2 minutes, but around that time we were invited to Gabon to do a photographic project, and we decided to shoot the whole thing on racist film. What does that mean? We went onto eBay and we managed to buy film that predates, film that Godard would have considered to be racist, so that predated this new film, this Kodak Gold. And we took these rolls and we went to Gabon, we went deep, deep into the rainforest, and we photographed a pygmy tribe in the process of an initiation ritual. And this what we were looking for was the most archetypal National Geographic, the kind of typical image of the pygmy taking iboga, hallucinating, going through all these things, and us, these whiteys, coming to take pictures of this. But of course we were shooting on this film that was out of date and actually predated anything that could render dark skin. And we shot a lot, and we ended up back in London. We processed this film, and unfortunately only one frame of this entire film survived, and it was this one. And the reason that it's very pink is that magenta is the most stable color, and so film is 60 years old, and all of the other pigments have slowly kind of decomposed and rendering the image very, very pink. So these are strategies. I'm going to skip over this because I've run out of time. These are strategies. This project then led on to another project where we discovered that the relationship between Polaroid and the South African state. And it turns out that there was 2 employees working for Polaroid in the 70s, so about the same time. One of them worked in the chemistry department, Caroline Hunter, and the other in the accounting. And they were married. And they kind of put their information together, and they worked out that Polaroid was selling over $1 million of equipment and materials to South Africa. And they were like, what's going on there? They were both black, and they began investigating, and they discovered that Polaroid had developed a camera for the apartheid state called the Polaroid ID2 camera. It was a very clever machine that had 2 lenses, and you could take a picture and then ask the subject to turn and take another picture. So you got a profile and a straight on one piece of film. So it was very efficient. And I have a picture of it over here. That's the camera. So they started a campaign for Polaroid to withdraw from South Africa. And they mounted this amazing campaign, and they really did get the attention of the head of the Polaroid Corporation, who sent a delegate to South Africa to investigate. And then they made a public declaration that Polaroid were indeed going to withdraw from selling equipment to apartheid. So that was the first example of a major American corporation withdrawing from South Africa, and it led to the divestment of all big corporations from South Africa. So it basically was the catapult that started, the catalyst that started divestment and essentially sanctions and the end of apartheid. So it's a very important story. But we thought, what can we photograph with this toxic camera? Because in a way, anything that you point it at is somehow imbued with this history. And the camera actually comes with an instruction manual, and in it says you must always hold the camera 1.2 meters from the subject. You must always press, if the person in the picture is black, you must press the button on the back, which is the boost button, which increases the power of the flash to get the detail of the dark skin. So you can see there that just built into the whole fabric of this machine is the idea of whiteness and blackness. And there were a number of other rules that we decided to disobey. First of all, we refused to photograph any subject. We certainly didn't keep to 1.2 meters away. You can see here the two pictures rendered on two sides. We decided to go on a road trip and make a kind of portrait of plant specimens in South Africa, a kind of love letter in a way to South Africa and to the fauna and flora of the country, but also an attempt to somehow resist the intention of this piece of equipment, of this technology. And I think because of time is so short, I'm afraid I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much.
I'd now like to introduce the third speaker on this second panel, Yasmin Gunaratnam. Yasmin Gunaratnam is a reader in sociology at Goldsmiths, where she teaches on race, feminism, disability, cultural representation and research methods. She is co-director of the Centre for Feminist Research. Her books include Researching Race and Ethnicity, Methods, Knowledge and Power, published by Sage, Death and the Migrant, from Bloomsbury Academic, and Go Home, ? The Politics of Immigration Controversies, which was published by Manchester University Press this year. Yasmin has edited 8 collections, including A Jar of Wild Flowers, Essays in Celebration of John Berger. She is on the editorial collectives of Feminist Review and Media Diversified. Thank you, Yasmin. Sound. Oh, you can see it. Okay. Sorry. Is it this machine? It's the one you had up before Nando's. Ollie, is this your laptop?
Yeah, I just closed it. Read my emails.
I know they've all got the Apple logo on. Other than that, I mean. Okay. Do you remember where exactly it is?
Thank you very much for coming and listening on a Saturday. So I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing, ethnographic work, for actually over about 20 years with dying migrants in the UK. And so it links both to some of what Oliver was talking about in terms of care homes and what Nando was talking about in terms of who we grieve for and dying. So I want to start off with a sculpture by Donald Rodney, who died of sickle cell in 1998, called Visceral Canker. The shield you see was one half of an exhibition which was connected to another coat of arms of Elizabeth I. So Rodney lived and worked with the materiality and semiotics of black body, to explore its intimacies and its abstractions, and most often he was circling the themes of race, migration, illness and gender. In Visceral Canker, there's the pulsating crossover of two biographies of pain and disease. It was first exhibited in 1990, and this is Rodney's reanimation of the heraldic shield of Sir John Hawkins, who was second cousin to Sir Francis Drake, and a seaman and England's first slave trader. The shield includes the image of what was called a demi-moor proper, a half-length black figure bound by his arms and ears atop the head of an armoured knight. Lower down on the crest, 3 slaves shackled by neck collars. To your right, amidst the silicone tubes and a blood bag, an electrical pump was intended to move Rodney's blood across the shields. When he tried to do this in Plymouth, they wouldn't let him because of health and safety regulations at the time. It was also a time when the AIDS crisis and myths were quite vibrant. So the tube passes over the knight's head, wraps itself around one of the golden lions, and trickles down the quarter of the shield where the shackled slaves look at us. I look and I look. To look at imperiled black bodies, at still moving images, demands effective labour that blurs sensory registers, Tina Campt argues. To look for traces of the frequencies of black lives is also to tune into sonic and haptic tonalities of violence, pain and trauma submerged below the surface of the rational gaze. To see how Rodney forges a strange kinship, a queer kinship. To be touched and moved by the installation demands a certain discomforting labour of connection, of feeling across vast differences, of navigating different constellations of white supremacy and violence, as much as differential relational vulnerabilities. And there is a circulation here, a return that Rodney puts into play as if his very life depended on it. In listening to the image, as Campt urges us to do, I cannot but help hear the Eritrean poet Aracelsus Gamay. Let us name every air between strangers, reunion. I start here because the installation materialises questions that I've long been struggling with. What does it mean to think of social justice and biology together, and in a context of all sorts of scales of loss? The task, of course, is politically hazardous, against the background of long-standing critical queer and feminist scholarship and activism that has fought so hard and so long to uncouple race from biology, to locate it in the realm of discourse and ideology. Here too is where whiteness has been located as a structure of power that operates through all types of racialising assemblages, transcoding and making hierarchies out of bodies, climate, space, time, language, faith, and the matter of life itself. So it's against this context that I ask, what does it mean to attend to non-normative bodies, the dying and the dead, and in the context of colonialism? Christina Sharp's analysis of the power of the wake is really important here, signalling the tugging undertow and afterlife of the foundational violence of slavery and colonialism. Her words always accompany me. So wake for Sharp has these different registers. The track left on the water's surface by a ship, the disturbance caused by a body swimming or moved in water. It is the air currents behind a body in flight, a region of disturbed flow. It's difficult to read and hear these meanings now without also thinking about the towering schemes of massacre, maiming and dehumaning that mark north to south migration at this moment. In Western Europe, we're living at the crossing point of two significant trajectories of mobility and exile. One has become known as the European refugee crisis, in quotes, a state of exception associated with catastrophic death and a governing of human multiplicity of those fleeing poverty and intensified violence, largely from Africa and the Middle East. The second, which is my focus here and which has received much, much less attention from critical scholars and artists, is the lives of Europe's post-war labour migrants. In England, these migrants have journeyed largely from Ireland, the Caribbean, Africa and the Indian subcontinent, and they're now ageing and dying. And outside of Europe, there are about 10 million people living in refugee camps, which in places like Lebanon, Kenya and Thailand disrupt the whole temporality of a camp. The average stay in a refugee camp in 2015 was 17 years. Rather than seeing these different trajectories of migration as separate, I am interested in what might lie between the lifelong effects of migration and refugeedom and more elemental points of acute crisis, so often marked by the opening of the body to the powers of earth, water, air and fire. And it's important to remember that even within the exceptionalising discourse of a European crisis, as Nando talked about, there are all sorts of biopolitical hierarchies of vulnerability and visibility. Despite the media focus on young single men, not all migrants and asylum seekers are young and in good health. And yet, despite the increasing use of borders as a necro-political tactic in Europe, it's also the case that borders fail. Territorial frontiers have always been vulnerable, not only materially, but also to effect, memory, fantasy, death ritual. The debilitated, dying and dead are always crossing borders in one way or another.
Arrived on Saturday night. Dock at Liverpool, Victoria train, the dressing ocean, grip tight. Sunday morning, looking out of the window, I took fright. Honest. Brick houses. Smoke through the chimney like West Indies boiling house where the mule go round grinding cane. Smoke coming out. I say, this house like boiling house? Made me live in plastering all week long. Always dressed in suit and tie to go to building site, winter and summer. That's how I come to catch this sickness. Old buildings, plasterboard and asbestos. I encounter it plenty, tearing down ceilings, inhaling, choking, coughing up dust, spit, thick, black like coal. 4 years I have this cough. 4 years. Down the Walworth Road, I buy different bush, boil it, roast lemon on top of the fire, squeeze it out with honey, like at home. Then the doctor showed me X-ray, shadow hovering over the lung. I take it with a smile. I grew up with good parents, believe in God. I trust and pray and things like that. Not planning to die over here. Not me. Not ever. I want to go home, bury in our land where I'm happy. My spirit free to fly like the bird over the mango tree, apple tree, rivers and the sea. When the moon shines at night, 7 times a year, can stand and look for miles and miles.
So some of the clips I'm showing you are what I call empirical performance that come out of my work and life story work with dying migrants. So one question that I'd like you to keep in mind is something from Robert McRuer's crip theory. Who haunts the margin of the work that we do, the margins of feminist, queer and disabled worlds? What would an ongoing commitment to those spectral presences entail? So I'm suggesting that at this moment there are both certain migrant bodies that are more visible and attract the white gaze more than others, and certain bodies that at different times come within the intersecting purview of the sorting processes of what Harsha Walia calls border imperialism, regimes of biopolitical that operate not only at the state but also at the level of our research and in art. It feels somewhat arrogant to me that the work of complexifying, if not yoking the ways in which race has become constitutive of different modes of inclusion and exclusion, is most prominently owned by activists, artists and scholars. I want to suggest that in the marginal spaces, those not so sexy spaces of the care home, the hospital, the hospice, post-colonial debility and disease are themselves already doing this sort of unhooking work, and in ways that have been given scant attention in their implications for how we think about whiteness, both as an impervious force and a vulnerability in liberal democracies, where racialization is now also conjugated with inclusion. So my interest then is in the biosocial stress points of diasporic debility, disease and dying, and what they can add to critical race, feminist and queer engagements with whiteness and migration. What kinds of demands does such attentiveness make, not only on thought and theory, but also how we might imagine, produce and practice care. Care, I think, is something that crosses all of our disciplines. Or perhaps how we might even think of projects of refutopia as queer transnational polities where whiteness as a modern machinery of race-making is indefinitely detained. For the migrant and refugees I'm concerned with, disease and ageing are producing phenomenal multiplicities and temporal switch points. Memory loss, varying states of consciousness, changes of habit and lifestyle that subvert the identity categories at the very basis of bureaucratic sorting processes. So I'm interested in the ways in which gender, race and sex normativity are drawn through the biochemical fabric of the body and circulate at times of disease and illness, which, as Rodney has suggested over and over again, are sites of racialisation that deserve much great attention. So how might critical engagements with disability and what feminist and queer writers sometimes talk about as debility help us to better recognise shifting forces of bodily violence and vulnerability, not only in the acute flashpoints, those spectacular moments, but in slow, dispersed violence over a lifetime? And how might this attentiveness help us to engage more critically with contemporary liberal democratic formations of whiteness that are present as both violence and care, as necropolitical borders and as humanitarian aid, and as immigration detention centres and care homes? It was interesting when I was doing some research on this that I found out that the company MITI, which is one of the largest providers of immigration detention services to the Home Office, also provides care in care homes. MITI's mission statement for their immigration centres, how I got to this connection was thinking, gosh, that wouldn't look out of place in a care home. So this is what it says about its immigration services. We pride ourselves on providing detainees with safe and secure immigration detention environment, which promotes respect and understanding of cultural differences, as well as safeguarding their well-being. It's not out of place, in fact, in a care home, because this is how they describe their healthcare services on another page. For over 20 years, we've worked with hospitals, doctors, surgeries, local authorities and private sector providers to improve people's care and create clean and safe environments for patients, residents, staff and visitors. So the links between care and immigration control that Docs Not Cops and other groups are mobilising around also has a structural basis which I think has been hidden. So as perversely as you will know that there's Rule 35, for example, of the 2001 detention centre rules, which is supposed to prevent the locking up of victims of torture, has been routinely contravened. There's been a number of reports on sexual abuses in care homes, and how vulnerable detainees have been treated. So I'm really interested in this sort of tension between care and how whiteness is produced. And Ida Daniwood, in a really interesting and compelling article called White Innocence in the Black Mediterranean, Hospitality in the Erasure of History, offers a compelling argument for how current ethical drives and the giving of hospitality to migrants in the so-called European crises constitutes a particular racial formation of whiteness by erasing interconnected colonial histories, and I would say providing opportunities for colonial amnesia to rehabilitate whiteness. So she says, with that, questions of responsibility, guilt, restitution, repentance and structural reform are turned into matters of empathy, generosity and hospitality. The result is a veil of ignorance which allows the white subject to reconstitute itself as ethical and good, innocent of its imperialist histories and present complicities. So I just want to move on as well to talk about just how some of the work, how we can think of debility in terms of bigger schemes and scales and structures. And I think Jasbir Kaur's work has been really interesting here. Her most recent book, The Right to Maim, has been looking at settler colonialism in Israel. And this is what she suggests. While the distinctions between living and dying are often recognised through the cuts of race and the folds of overlapping population construction and management, maiming, debilitation and stunting are relatively under-theorised components of these cuts and folds. Centering these processes may potentially alter presumed relations to living and dying altogether. So I'm really interested in the ongoingness and haunting of colonialism and the predicaments this poses for liberal whiteness, where the performance of anti-racism, or at least a gesturing through to equality, can arrest and detain white supremacy as much as give it a charge. And I'm also interested in the slow violations of race hierarchies, how they are lived and how they are resisted. So scene 2, terminal restlessness. Come and join the feminist historian Caroline Steedman in bed in a cheap hotel. Steedman can't sleep. The beginnings of Derrida's archive fever are settling in. That nasty, unwashed blanket is bugging her. Obsessing about the bed, Steedman tells us, is a screen anxiety. What's keeping me awake, she said, is not the dirt and debris. It's actually the archive and its myriads of the dead who all day long have pressed their concerns upon you. You think, I could get to hate these people, and then I can never do these people justice, and finally I shall never get it done. The dead press in on me too, as I work on the history of hospice and palliative care and the concept of total pain developed by the English doctor Cicely Saunders that recognises pain as not only physical but also social and spiritual. Sifting through box after box in the Cicely Saunders archive in King's, the ghosts of dead migrants start to appear as paradata in Saunders' patient records. Mrs. S is described as a charming West Indian, in pain, tearful and depressed, much alone with her illness. There is a Mrs. P, a patient with an extermination camp background, who later developed severe depression with hallucinations helped by ECT. Another patient with an Egyptian-sounding name. After the name come 2 words, another loner. How did I get here? Another bed, another woman. It's the autumn of 1992. My mother is dying. Despite living in England since 1967 and working as a nurse until she retired, belonging had always been precarious. We were once stopped from going to Malta on a holiday and deported by immigration officers with guns. She never quite got over at that, and that was the point when she finally applied for British citizenship. Now hooked up to intravenous morphine, long after sinking into waves of unconsciousness, she still clutches a small wooden statue of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. From time to time, and with a rhythm of her own, she presses the statue to her lips. A couple of days before she dies, she has passing bouts of agitation, but she is without physical pain. In the early hours of one morning, eyes closed, fingers gesticulating, she speaks some of her last words to me. The man is coming, she says. Get the tickets and the passports. Terminal restlessness and anguish are disorders not uncommon in the last stages of life, and they cross the semantic psychic border. They can include altered states of consciousness, hallucinations, impaired memory, agitation and anxiety, olfactory flashbacks and tactile hallucinations. These are hybrid conditions, thought to be the result of changing physiology. Oliver Sacks on hallucinations. Some people feel that hallucinations and strange thoughts of delirium may provide or seem to provide moments of rich emotional truth. He goes on, deliria convey a sense of a journey. I began to see how fact and fantasy were admixed in the hieroglyphic form. I'm reminded here of Fanon's sociodiagnostics. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon documented colonialism's violent denial of the colonised humanity, using the pathological and psychoanalytic language that informed his clinical interests. This was one of the earliest texts to connect and diagnose racism as a form of pathology and bodily suffering. For racialised others to live under conditions of colonialism, for Fanon, was to live in a constellation of delirium, frequently bordering on the region of the pathological. The use of the medical word delirium there is significant, suggesting that colonialism produces absence and ellipses that gorge out and unsettle presence in ways that can be expressed as, but also exceed psychological pathology. The biological and the social are actually very interwoven in Fanon's analysis. And furthermore, by instating and making that diagnosis, he instated a causal pathway, injustice leading to bodily suffering, connecting the life of the clinic to politics. And Black Skin's full of those phenomenological descriptions of the day-to-day impact of living with colonialism, racism, and whiteness. So, just a question. Terminal restlessness, colonialism, and whiteness. Where does it begin? Where does it end? So scene 2, and just very quickly, I've just called this Between Rockhampton and a Hard Place. This is a quote from a memoir by Edward Kennedy, who is a white Englishman who served in the Queensland Police. And he said, It has been said by some that all human beings, when at last in extremis, lift their eyes to heaven. This may be generally true, but from my observation, I do not think the rules apply to the Australian black. Near Rockhampton, a black fellow had committed a diabolical outrage on a white woman, from the effects of which she died. The man was sentenced to be hanged, and I was present at the execution. Standing as I was immediately in front of the gallows, I had ample opportunity of judging in what manner the murderer comported himself. Up to the very last moment he had use of his eyes. He scanned the forest, the valleys, the waters, but never for one instant turned his eyes heavenwards. The indigestible and disturbing memory that haunts Kennedy right into his end-of-life memoir is an anomaly that refuses assimilation and repression. In the words of Ross Gibson, the black man who chose to dedicate his last moments to the forests and waters could not be dragged into Christianity. The event that impressed itself so deeply upon Kennedy's psyche has varied resonances. It's a biographical narrative that documents the historical violations spread and engendering of settler colonialism. Kennedy observes the black man's last moments of life from a relatively privileged vantage point. A sense of racial spectatorship and surveillance saturates the account. The movement of the man's eyes become a test of the humanity of the race that he stands for. In the late 19th century Queensland of Kennedy's youth, the racialised scene was not yet so readily conflated with the known. To live in this place at this time was to be in a quandary, Gibson avers. How to recognise everyday events and objects as signs, what to make of the Aborigines' demeanour. So when the eyes of the black man do not turn to the heavens, the oculocentric and racialised schema is unsettled. white ignorance is foregrounded. There's a dark diachronicity to the event, where meaning is withdrawn and a sensual residue evades incorporation by whiteness. I'm going to stop there, but I was going to just show a short clip from a nurse who exactly is talking about caring for an African woman dying from AIDS related conditions, and they suspect she had AIDS related dementia. And the nurse completely she cannot bridge this difference. So I want to suggest that there's something really important in the ways in which whiteness is both arrested and also its vulnerabilities. So, for example, with Edward Said and thinking about Orientalism, otherness kind of happens in a way that's quite encompassing, but othering, the machinery of othering changes over time. So in terms of thinking about what white cultures might do and what whiteness might do, I want to think about how we might arrest its momentum. So I'll just stop there.
We'll go into a panel discussion now with the three speakers we've just heard, if you could all take a seat here. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Ben Burbridge, who's a senior lecturer in art history at the University of Sussex, who's going to chair the discussion for you this afternoon.
Thanks, Dan. Can everybody hear? Yeah. Thanks. For three really fascinating papers. Where to start? Okay, so one way in which I guess we can begin to think about the papers in relationship to one another is in terms of how we narrate migration, the narratives around migration, and an effort to complicate, unpack, decode, recode kind of reductive hegemonic narratives around particularly the migrant crisis at the moment. Right. One of the things I'm interested in terms of the context of this talk and in the context of your work as an artist and as researchers are the audiences for the alternative narratives that you're bringing into being. So who you see those audiences as being and what you see as the factors potentially determining who those audiences are.
Well, I could start by talking about the audience. The film that I showed had a very specific audience and a very difficult audience. That was a commission by On the Underground for a piece of work that was to be shown in the underground. And of course it's a public space, and there was we had a lot of conversations amongst us about how do we address the subject in such a public way. Is it the right context for a conversation even about this, or is it too complicated, or are we at risk of simplifying things? But we felt compelled to try. It just felt like the opportunity to make a public work, this platform that we were being offered, it felt like it should be an attempt to somehow speak to an audience, and certainly that kind of number of people. But one of the things we did before we made the work was we went and we spoke to lots of people who work in the underground. And we met one of the chief controllers of the underground, and we asked him, well, what does a human being mean to you in the system of moving people around the city? Are they customers? Are they an obstacle? What are people? And he said something very revealing, which was that a person enters the system, travels through it, and leaves, and it's their intention that it's a completely unmemorable experience. So, and that was his phrase. And for a long time, the title of our project was An Unmemorable Experience, because this idea that you travel to work or you travel home and that you somehow are being asked to forget. And in fact, the idea of placing a piece of artwork in this context where people are where forgetting is kind of part of the journey, seems almost absurd, because a piece of art is intended to stop and to make you think, to make you conscious, to make you remember. So this is what we were fighting against, and in fact, very sadly, actually, the film is only now being shown at certain points of the day, not all the way through the day, because the film actually is too much of an obstacle. The sound is too irritating, and the ticket staff are going absolutely berserk, and they've complained to the head of their union to have us shot. So we weren't very successful, unfortunately. I think we were trying too hard to create too much of an obstacle. But so maybe I've said enough about our audience.
I guess my first audience, so I a lot of my work is also teaching and training with doctors and care professionals. So the academic side of it, even though I'm an academic, is much less important to me. So I've been trying to find ways to communicate with non-specialist, diverse audiences, and I think poetry and art has a real role to play in that. So I've been interested in how art can really deal with non-linearities of time and space. But the work that I've been doing most recently is on what's called social suffering. So the idea that injustice and inequality hurt. And so that's kind of been trying to get out more and engage practitioners and communities in thinking that through.
I guess for the project I was presenting, I mean, that's partly as part of the way that the project came to be. It was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council as an urgency grant. And the idea was to really be able to fit within a policy debate, but also in the public debate, and in a sense to also help to tackle this moral panic that was spreading around. So the idea was to challenge some of the assumptions that were reproduced through the film. So that was on one level, I would say. The idea, in fact, when the project came out, before it was published, and we engaged with the media, the news articles, overhead, and all these kind of things. I try to engage in multiple dimensions. There is an issue about how do we tell the story of migrants or migration, which is also more sort of epistemological, about the production of knowledge on migration. We tend to, and this is a big problem in refugee studies in particular, to focus too much on the voices of the hidden voices of refugees, in a sense. And we're forgetting that, for example, the first time that an asylum seekers really tell their story, it will be to a policeman or a policewoman or to the Home Office. And they tend to almost romanticize this idea that you invite someone to tell their own stories, forgetting that the story is placed in a series of stories, in a series of episodes in their life, in which it's actually very difficult to verbalize as a linear, but also in general tell the story. And then what often happens is people start to question is it true what you're telling me? Are you lying? So it's a continuous part of the experience of a lot of people we engage with. So in a sense, using theater, also co-production, has become something we're using more and more. So I try to engage and get the people that came here as asylum seeker to become researcher with us. Now, in another project I'm doing, we're trying to basically get a group of young people be part of a project for the last 3 years, from thinking about the question you ask to doing the research, and now also contributing writing the research, as a way of somehow also tackling this issue about where this voice comes from and where it goes.
Okay, thank you. So, and those latter two answers kind of generates a question for kind of Oliver that I think may kind of rebound in terms of the kind of use value, right? And I mean, there seems to be a question bubbling up around this urgent need to develop meaningful counter-narratives in other ways, because the dominant narratives are so problematic and so caught up in all of the issues that were being discussed this morning. And so I'm interested in you working for this, this large audience, whether you see kind of an instrumental value to your work as an artist, hearing kind of discussion there about art serving a more directly instrumental role in terms of working with particular people, particular groups of people who may kind of alter their professional practices in light of a conversation being had through art. And I wondered if you had those kind of goals as an artist.
Well, I think all three of us are sort of trying to do the same thing, which is to kind of expand the biography of this crisis. And make it something, just to be aware of its complexity. And obviously there's a tendency in mainstream reportage on the subject to simplify. And I think we're all trying to look at the complexity and kind of unpick that and expand on the story. And, we attempted to do that by looking at this crisis in the context of migration from Europe and to Europe over the century, and see it as part of a bigger story. And I think we've all just had our different strategies of trying to do that. Whether, in the case of our work, whether a piece of artwork is effective in communicating that to an audience, in a way is not something that I want to get kind of blocked by. Because if I ask myself, is this doing something, every time, I wouldn't make any art. And art doesn't function in that same didactic way. Just the fact that it got made and that the art on the underground is prepared to support the production of that work, just that action is enough. Whether it gets somebody stops in the underground and they see it and they feel compelled, or they become conscious in some way of the complexity, that's wonderful if that does happen. But these are all different strategies towards, I think, a similar goal.
I was fascinated by the idea that, in a sense, the piece of art the installation was successful because it was slowing the flow, in a sense. In a sense, was probably people were stopping on the way to there and then was not working in a way that a train station should work. That is, as you say, it has to be like, you want to be sanitized and completely sort of go through without having any memory of it.
Sure.
And the other part, I was looking at your interview around the piece that you did, was online. It's also the idea that a very significant part of the people that use those trains, especially if it's the underground, the private state, are the migrants themselves. They may be refugees themselves. So it's a quite interesting way of re-embedding a story within the setting.
Well, sure, yeah. There's the obvious thing of people on a journey watching a film about people on a journey, but the journeys couldn't be more difficult, and the outcomes couldn't be more. One is extremely dangerous, the other one is very banal. You're going to work, you're going home, you're going to meet your girlfriend or whatever. But the other thing that we were trying to communicate in the film was this conception of the Mediterranean, which is, it's kind of in our minds, it's a playground, it's a place that we go on holiday, it's a sublime place, it's exquisite. We look at that water and you want to dive into it. I just want to pop open a bottle of Campari. That's the Mediterranean. That's why the music is so jarring, because it's got this kind of Fellini-esque kind of joyful, celebratory, Mediterranean, circusy kind of feeling. And it's when it hits the scenes of the refugees and the music and those familiar images, that's when that kind of those two things collide in a way that's very disturbing and remind us that the Mediterranean is both a playground and a war zone simultaneously.
Now, I'll open it to the floor in a moment, because I'm well aware that there are people who have much more interesting things to say than I have. But one final observation, a question based on really the relationship between economics and racism in all three talks, and the extent to which racism is encoded within a whole series of economic practices. In terms of Polaroid, presumably this is they were using a white woman because this was the predominant market for Polaroid film in the first instance. And in terms of, it was striking with the poem with the guy who this is as a consequence of doing kind of crappy, underpaid work. And then also in terms of the images of children that we're not seeing and the extent to which this is presumably based on which photographs are going to sell papers. So I don't know if anyone had kind of more to say about how that process of encoding takes place, and also how we could try and kind of recode those practices or reshape those practices, because, I mean, hopefully that's something that can come out of these kinds of discussions, is actually find roots beyond this kind of continual reproduction of this horrendous situation.
Yeah, I was quite, when you were just talking about that, one of the things that came to mind was John Bertrand Jean Moore's The Seventh Man. And there's a line in that which talks about, particularly in terms of my interests, how migrants don't get sick, they don't die. So the whole issue of disabled or a migrant who can't work, they're a murky presence within capitalism's unconscious. You know, so I think partly also what we need to do is the disrupting, which Nando was also talking about, and which I think was being a theme in terms of also talking about whiteness, but between the good and the deserving and the bad, which is for migrants is very much underpinned by an economic model. You know, how much can we extract from you? And then what we're now facing, a crisis, I think, particularly at this point in the UK, is that those people who came over who were supposed to build the NHS up and the transport systems, they're now dying and in need of care themselves, you know. So I think there's that dance around the deathbed, which is also an economic dance that's really interesting.
When we have been looking at the issue of the money in the crisis, is actually the way that the production of a narrative of the crisis has got is a political economy. Just to give you an example, within the context of this moral economy of us feeling that there is an invasion going on, there has been a series of actors that are benefiting massively. In some of the things I've been writing about, for example, I looked at the way that the European Border Agency, Frontex, has been inflating the number of people entering into Europe systematically and continuously, and they still do it. And I managed to get them to admit that they were double counting people, and now they've had the small footnote at the bottom of their press release, in which they say, well, we may be double counting illegal entries in Europe, but they still use big numbers. They still talk, for example, of 1 million people waiting on the beach in Libya to cross into Europe. Even if in the last 3 years, I mean, the largest number of people that crossed from Libya was 171,000, and now it's gone down to under 100,000. So there's the idea of boosting the number, boosting the panic, as part of the idea that if you look at the budget of Frontex, for example, went from 3 to about 170 billion euros in the last 10 years, 15 years. I don't remember certain number, but it's actually, this is the scale. When you start to have invest into more border controls, what does it mean? When, for example, Europe suspends Schengen and they have to reopen the internal borders, do you think that still they got border police? They haven't got them anymore. I mean, we don't really have the infrastructure. And now one of the problems with Brexit for Britain is that actually they have rebuilt the border facilities between France and UK. So what they do contract with groups like G4S or the private contractors. Or they're using drones. And so there is all this business of producing technology border controls. So feeding this narrative of crisis is actually also part of a new economy that is self-reproducing itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, should we open it to questions?
Yes, please.
There's one at the back there. Can you wait for the mic? Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm actually struggling with this question. I was almost trying not to ask it, and then I realized that by doing that, I was performing a form of labor that I felt quite uncomfortable with. But I wanted to ask, particularly the first two speakers, I wanted to ask you about your relationship with the term Black Death Spectacle. I'm particularly thinking about, in your presentation, Nando, when you talked about the way that the Alan Kurdi image has been used and why he was used. And then in the following slide, you had an anonymous dead African girl, which was presented without any kind of warning, and in complete contrast to the image that you chose of Alan Turkey. And I find that a decision that I would like to be explained further. And to a lesser extent, Oliver, also I'm interested in the utilization of black bodies as material, the materiality of black bodies, and in relation to this idea of the Black Death spectacle. So I wonder if you had any thoughts or comments about that. It's not to kind of suggest that your work isn't, that I don't find your work extremely interesting and valuable, but that particularly within the context of the question that's being posed today, what should white culture do? I think that the discussion would benefit from further exploration of those 2 points. Thank you.
Should I? Okay. It's actually that image is one that comes in and out of my presentation because it's a very problematic one, and there are, I can list reasons pro and cons by why showing it or not. So what is interesting there, it's interesting the point you make about the Black Death spectacles. If I look at it through the perspective of the refugee crisis, there has been no Black Death spectacles because you've never seen dead bodies that were from black people, despite the fact that the very large majority of the people that died at sea are actually people that are coming through Africa into Europe. The body that you have seen that have been considered more deserving to be cried for are the ones that are white. They were coming from Syria or they were coming from the other side. You haven't seen that image, and one of the mechanisms by that image has been kept out of our conversation is because it was considered to be offending for our sensitivity. Now, we have seen the photos of Alan Kurdi has been clicked about, visualized about 3 million times in the first 12 hours since it was online. This image was, I basically come across to it just almost by chance, and then disappeared from the website where it was there. So it's quite interesting to see how you haven't seen that image, and in a sense, it's actually interesting to see why we haven't, thinking about why we haven't seen that kind of image. And I know, I mean, that image it's painful in many ways, and it, not many ways, it's absolutely painful. But it's actually really important to bring it in conversation, because one of the ways that justification is said it was sanitizing the view, because people get offended. But actually, that's actually a mechanism to keep out the story in the migration crisis. That's why I use it. Maybe I should use the warning sign before it, and normally, but I think it's quite important to say it, even if briefly. That will be my reasoning for that.
And I would totally support that. I mean, I think it's essential that we look at those images, and I think it's a good thing that you included it in your presentation, and it would have been a gaping silence if you hadn't. And I disagree with the person in the audience that it wasn't adequately signposted. I think the whole context of this event today and your presentation up until that point very clearly brought us to that point in a way that wasn't surprising to me at all. I think it is, those kind of images are very, very difficult to look at. But it's imperative that we try to sidestep this kind of shortcut to empathy in a way, this kind of emotional response to the thing. And use this sort of situation as an opportunity to, as we've said already, discuss the complexities of and the context and the history of an image like that. I mean, this idea of the Black Death spectacle is a big problem within the whole history of photography. Any photographer who isn't prepared to face this problem isn't a photographer. And I think what I tried to communicate in my very short presentation was that when we began as photographers, we were working in a very kind of old-school documentary mode, going around the world, taking photographs with our camera, kind of performing this outdated kind of flow of power between the witness and the subject, which is a problem, and which is why when I showed that short film in South Africa, it was very important for me to communicate that kind of film wouldn't be made today, and that's a good thing. And I think that there's a problem with that film. I'm not showing that work as a kind of example of something that I'm proud of particularly. I think there's a problem with the idea of two UK-based white men going back to South Africa and representing the new South Africa. And like I said, I don't think that would happen today. Sorry, yeah.
Do you want to respond?
If I'm not taking too much Oscar away from other people, I'd like the opportunity to respond. Thank you. Forgive me, but I think that there is no dearth of like dead black bodies in the news, and also I feel that. Well, I guess the question is who is it that needs empathy? Who needs to develop a sense of empathy towards the bodies of dead black children?
I'm saying empathy is not going to help. We need to avoid empathy. Empathy it's an emotional response, and what we need is an intellectual and a critical response to dead bodies, be them black or white. But
I think that's total bollocks. I'm sorry, because the reason why Donald Trump is president is because people voted emotionally and with empathy. It's not because they were intellectual about it. The way in which, in general, human beings experience the world is through emotion as much as it is through anything else. It's not just an entirely intellectual response to things. We are not yet robots. And I find even that kind of level of detachment, again, incredibly challenging. And I think that it is in contrast with the presentation of the ideas, the context and the presentation of no, I'm sorry, but no.
I mean,
I think I just want to thank you for that question, because I think what it does raise is sort of issues around what Stuart Hall called the politics of representation. So I think it is about thinking, so what other ways do we need to see that? Could you have maybe, I don't know, talked about it? And these are all things to sort of think about in terms of representation. So for me, I think it's really important to open up, because we don't all want to agree. So I think thinking about these points of tension within representation and within our own practices, and it is something that I always struggle with. And so I don't I don't work in that area, but to think very carefully about how images might reinscribe certain forms of race thinking is something that we have to walk a very critical line, and I think it balances on a knife edge. So I think Oliver talked about complicity in your presentation, and complicity again is something that can be complex and involved, or partnership in an evil action, So I think it's important to use complicity as an ethical sort of line that we're continually walking across, and sometimes we fall off, we get it wrong, but the question that you've raised is a really important one.
I agree that was an important question, but I disagree with the analysis to many levels. First, the point of the argument I was making is that dead bodies counted if they were masses, if they were coming through the central Mediterranean route. So in a sense, if there were 10, 15 people, 20 people dying, we don't know about it. They're not even reported in the news. The only tragedies that we have spoken about, and they make the difference within the narrative of the crisis, when they were happening in the central Mediterranean route, were the largest, the mass sort of event. At some point, you had to have at least 600 people dying because the things was ending up on the front line. Okay. On the other side, what I've noticed is, what I wanted to point out is that despite there is a narrative there that we need to stop people dying at sea, that was actually what was used as a justification by the EU government. It was playing with this sense of solidarity, of empathy. Let's all love the refugees that has been spreading around. A lot of very good feelings in Europe. But a lot of this very good feeling have been misplaced and have not been necessarily criticized, or there has not been enough self-reflexivity on where we were putting our solidarity in. Okay? So the point is that when you have, why we all the time we had one single event in which one person, a boy, died. The only one that we know about is, it happens to be a white little boy that came from Syria. So the question was, why don't we try to think about why it's the case, you know? And the only way to push you to think about it was to show that photo that you haven't seen. And I don't think that only with words I could have achieved the same kind of goal. That's the justification. And there is other negative side to this, but I think it's actually absolutely important for us to move beyond a sort of a facile humanitarianism and try to be actually more critical, deconstruct what's happening, understand what the crisis is about, and also try to actually really understand why we are crying someone, not someone else. And I need to see why we didn't cry with that girl. I mean, that's the reason, from my point of view.
Is it okay for the keynote to speak? I don't know if I can pose a question. But do you identify as black? Okay, so here's the problem. You've got a black woman in the audience, and here the theme of the conference is what should white culture do? And then I heard the critique that white people, not white people, but we ought to somehow become more intellectual, more abstract in our understanding of race issues. But that's precisely the problem. Part of the problem is that white men have always occupied positions of the intellective and ratiocination. And it's my claim that white people need to first ask the question, are they capable of empathy? As a question coming from the US, the question becomes, are you even capable of empathy? That's where we should begin. And what I'm hearing from the white gentleman is a way of really taking away the voice of this woman here, placing it under erasure through some kind of abstract theoretical lens. And the problem with showing the black body, I get your point that if they're not represented, you have to represent them. But the problem is, even as I was watching the image, there was no critical commentary. As we say in the US, you've got to name her, right? You didn't name the body. Also, you didn't talk about the paradox that's involved in precisely showing the body that is typically erased, but by showing the body by not naming it, you've just doubly erased the body. So I think it's important that you give a much more thick, rich narrative of that black body when you show it. Otherwise, it becomes another anonymous black body that is left unexplained. So I think that's deeply problematic, and also a reinscription of precisely whiteness.
Does she have a black body? On his PowerPoint it said she was in Yemen now, so please don't give her another identity. She's a black body. Hey, look, if she was in the United States, she was in the United States, she would be rich, okay, depending on the time of the year. But that girl was not a black Arab, she was a Yemeni. It's black to me. Is she white? They're doing exactly the same thing. No. Yeah, but is she white? You should meet some Afro-Arabs. She's Yemeni.
Do we have any other questions? There's a question down here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about whether it was still important to go to potentially post-colonial locations, and whether you thought that it was possible to go and address past colonial mistakes, to have conversations with people who live in those post-colonial locations, and potentially even to learn from them. For example, I'm thinking about Uganda, which is currently hosting 1.1 million South Sudanese refugees. Why can't we go and learn from those locations and then apply that knowledge to Europe, to America?
I mean, I think that work is being done. There's some very interesting work that's being done in different locations, so in Lebanon, for example. And so I think what the problem is that the European narrative is completely dominated, much more long-standing work as well. So that was partly, I mean, there's interesting work. One of your past colleagues has been doing some work on Refutopia. Is that, yeah, Refugia, yeah. Mm-hmm. Which has been, where's that been based? The empirical studies have been based on.
They haven't done it. The idea is that was looking at the experience of the protectorate in the 1930s, and it was spent. You could rethink at a new space for the refugees, and there was an article coming out recently on Foreign Affairs, I think.
But there has been some work done, particularly I know in terms of Lebanon as well, that's been looking at how, so people who've been there for decades, what might that constitute in terms of thinking about new forms of citizenship and new ways of thinking about migration. So I think some of that work is going on, but it's been dominated by other forms of narrative.
And I was thinking particularly from the perspective of photographers or filmmakers or researchers who would go from the UK to a post-colony. I didn't make that clear. Do you think, Oliver, it's still important that people should still go, or should they concentrate their efforts elsewhere, or perhaps enable someone else to do that role?
It's a bit of a hypothetical question, but I'm just trying to think of a work that I think most effectively does that, and I think what I'm thinking of is Renzo Mountain's work, Enjoy Poverty, which I don't know if any of you are aware, familiar with, but in which he goes back to Congo as a white man from the Netherlands, and very provocatively the work is called Enjoy Poverty, and I think he carries a neon sign to Congo that says Enjoy Poverty, and it's a very provocative film about representations of black hungry children who don't get named, and he demonstrates very eloquently how these images are produced, and it's very confronting, and I think we learn a lot. It's a very didactic film in a way, and we learn a lot about how photographers produce images, and then how those images become a form of currency that go out and get distributed, and very often lose a connection with the person in the picture. And actually the person who's being photographed very often is very unaware of the processes at stake and the value of this image as a commodity. So that's one great example of why it's important to make this kind of work.
How long have we got left? Wrap it up. Should have one more question? Okay, one more question. Woman in the middle there.
Thank you. I like very much the aspect of entangled histories, and also what we discussed this morning, the kind of, I think it was this morning, oblivion of European colonial imperial history. So you've been talking in a way about a crisis, and maybe it's in reference of what has been produced in the media, that this is a crisis, which is not a crisis, is part of history. This region has experienced a lot of movements, we know it, colonialism as first, massive white European immigration in the 18th, 19th century, a settler colonialism. So in a way, I was wondering why the use of the term crisis in this context, which is a kind of media production, a Eurocentric production also, a recentering of white Europe. And within this context, of course, there is a problem with representation on the level that within this kind of entanglement, we always have a public sphere of representation that create the other as a thing. And this kind of images that we've seen are images of thinkification. And so the question is, how can we deal with it differently without being part, because it's also who watches and who hurts it. For whom is this crisis? And what is it? I very much love your paper, Yasmin, because it's about vulnerability, it's about livability, it's about the precariousness of our lives, it's about mourning. What do we do when we mourn? We do work in order to render justice. And what kind of work is doing Europe? Nothing.
if anyone wants to respond. Anybody first?
I'm a little scared to speak now.
Just about the crisis thing, I mean, from the title and onward, it's always in inverted commas, so in a sense, and also the answer to the question about what's the political economy of the crisis, why it was produced. I think we need to move beyond the idea, that there has always been movement, and so this was not a crisis. What I'm trying to explain is why actually we use the term, we have been sort of led to use the term crisis and what kind of interest it serves. So that will be the way that I'm using the term. And then there is the other part of the couple. So it's been the battle between the migrant crisis of the refugee crisis, which we have seen moving like a pendulum in the last 3 years, and now it's clearly become more a migrant crisis, because increasingly in the hegemonic discourse, what you assign to the word migrants is negative, and what you got refugees still got a little bit of positive meaning attached to it. So what you see is basically the movement of people from Northern Africa into Europe have been completely relabeled as not refugee movement, and then partly is becoming a justification for taking a much more military approach to stopping the movement. So and the other point, maybe I didn't make it clear enough, in terms is the second step of this movement is that because we only care for when people die close to the shores of Europe, and the only time when European authorities feel a responsibility vis-à-vis these bodies is when they are close. What they're actually doing now is to fund militias in Libya so people don't get many more in the sea. Doesn't matter they continue to die, doesn't matter they ending up in prison or they bounce back in the desert, but there is no claim for responsibility for those people. So that's it's in a sense that we don't talk anymore of a crisis. It's quite interesting. As you look at the narrative, it's not actually longer a crisis because you don't have any more people crossing the Mediterranean. So it's quite an interesting term to unpack.
Okay, we've got to wrap it up, but hopefully I'm sure there'll be lots more time for questions and discussion after the final session.
The timetable says we reconvene at 5. Obviously that's in 9 minutes, and we need a slightly longer break than that. So should we say 10 past, which gives everyone 20 minutes? Is that comfortable enough?
Okay, thanks again to our panelists.